Hey everyone, and welcome to this podcast. It's been a little while. I just got back from spending some time in Italy and in Scandinavia. The first part was really for a sabbatical that I'm on, studying St. Francis, which is why today's podcast is going to focus on St. Francis. And the second part was, well, I'm in Europe and I've never been to Scandinavia. So we went to Copenhagen and Stockholm and Oslo, and it was an amazing time. But as we think about this podcast and we think about this idea of religionless faith, spent a lot of time on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And now what I want to do is make a shift into talking about Francis of Assisi. And part of this is in thinking about the possibility of a book that I'm writing that will focus on religionless faith and the practices, the spiritual practices, maybe of those who aren't sure, if that they believe or they're wrestling with belief. So what does that look like? And so today what I want to do is begin the discussion of St. Francis by focusing on this idea of failure. And what can we learn from St. Francis of Assisi? What does a 13th century wandering preacher, who today is most often thought of as a garden decoration, what does he have to say to those who have abandoned religious faith? Now, I should emphasize, I met quite a few people on the way who would fit this category. And I hope to incorporate some of their stories in the podcast and eventually in the writing. But for now, it's a question of, how does a medieval miracle worker who is immersed in a religious world of angels and demons and spectacular visions, how does he provide a way of thinking about religionless faith? Now, if you're walking the Via di Francesco, the way of St. Francis, coming from the north, you end up going up some very steep hills as you come out of this little town called Val Fabrica. It's a beautiful little town. We spent the night there, had some great food there, stayed right downtown, and just a very lovely little community. But when you come up this hill and you come out the other side, the horizon opens up and you can see the town of Assisi in the distance. And the town is marked by two imposing structures. The highest point is what they call the Major Rocca, this medieval castle that really provides a strategic vantage point. And it did that for rulers and armies and so on. They could kind of look over the town and just kind of keep track of what's going on in the town, but they could also see outside of the town and watch for people who were going to attack. But the other is the Basilica of St. Francis, this hulking structure that juts out from the base of Mount Subasio. And in between, you get the town of Assisi that just kind of climbs right up the side of the mountain. And to get anywhere, you have to walk up or downhill, leveling off at plazas in front of temples and churches. And this directional framework, this up and down, provides, I believe, the perfect metaphor for the social world of Assisi at the time of St. Francis. Now, just to give a little bit of background, Francis was born into a medieval world of feudal lords, empires, and the powerful Roman Church. The early writings about Francis are written as hagiography, meaning that they're written to make a case for Francis, to demonstrate his holiness and really to legitimize his movement as part of the Roman Catholic Church. And all of these writings reflect what philosopher Charles Taylor would call the social imaginary of medieval Europe. In other words, by social imaginary, we're saying this is how they imagine the world to be. It's, like you're driving a car and you're going from one place to another and you don't think about where you're going because you've done it so much. The world makes sense. And the social imaginary of medieval Europe at the time of Francis is a hierarchical world of higher and lower. And this includes the spiritual world. So think of angels and demons and miracles, all of which interacts with the material world. And all of this is supported then by this sacramental system in which grace and salvation is available through this great chain that moves again from higher to lower, from God, who's the highest, through the incarnation of Jesus Christ to the apostolic authority of the church. And then it's dispensed through material objects like bread or wine, or even the clothes or the bones of a holy person. So in this world, too, divine authority is invested in individual people. So the emperor, for example, signifies the divine power of God to rule and bring order to the world, while the pope and the bishops and the priests of the church represent the spiritual power of God to bring grace and salvation. And I think it's important that we recognize this hierarchical understanding of reality shaped the social world of Assisi. So around the time of Francis, there were growing tensions between two different groups of people, two rivals, the Bonhoeffers and the Populo. So the Bonhoeffers were members of the aristocracy. They're the ones who owned the land, had the titles, had all the wealth, and all of this is generated from the feudal system. The Populo referred to a growing middle class of merchants, of which Francis's father, Pietro, a cloth merchant, was a member. The Bonhoeffers lived in the upper part of Assisi, while the Populo lived in the lower sections of the mountain. And out of this tension comes a civil war. And as a result, the aristocratic families, many of them, ended up either fleeing or being kicked out of Assisi, and they went to the neighboring town of Perugia, which is a rival community across the valley. And when you stand in the plaza at St. Clare's Basilica, you can look out. It's a beautiful view. You can look out across the valley and you can see across the way the town of Perugia. Now, Perugia was really a bigger power than Assisi at the time, although Assisi was on the rise. And so, kind of stoked by these exiles coming into Perugia, Perugia decided to invade Assisi in an attempt to weaken what they saw as kind of an ascending rival. Now, all of this had a profound influence on Francis. So as a member of the Populo, he was born into a family that had some privilege. So he had, some wealth and some means, but he was always looking up, both symbolically and literally. He wanted to be a noble, and the quickest path for him to do that was to become a knight. So when war broke out between Assisi and Perugia, Francis joined the battle. He rode out to war, and he participated in the Battle of Collestrata, where the army from Assisi was ultimately defeated and Francis was taken captive. Now, he was in captivity for a year, and in some sources they talk about how his friends were suffering and being tortured. Some of them were dying, but because he came from a wealthy merchant family, he was used as a pawn for ransom. But it's also reported, and I'm actually drawing this from Andre Vauchez's book, Francis of Assisi, The Life and Afterlife of a Medieval Saint. It's a great book. I think he straddles a wonderful line as he's dealing with all of the sources. But in retelling the story, he gives this quote that Francis annoyingly told his fellow captives. Francis apparently said to them, "Know that one day I will be venerated through the whole world." Now imagine you're sitting there in captivity and this guy still is having these kind of visions of grandeur. His desire was to become a knight and a nobleman and to climb the social hierarchy of Assisi. He wanted to achieve wealth and fame. But interestingly, when he was finally ransomed by his father and comes back to Assisi, he comes back broken and ill. He's sick. And this event had a profound effect upon Francis. I think today we might say that he suffered from PTSD, as many veterans of war and people held hostage or in captivity do. And for the early biographers of Francis, this period marks the beginning of his conversion. There's a slow transformation that begins to take place, a transformation from the Francis of this middle-class cloth merchant wanting to become a nobleman to St. Francis as he is now known. But after a long illness, so he comes back to Assisi and he's sick. And so he's kind of laid up for a long period of time. He decides he wants to try again. And so he sets out once again to try to get victory and fame on the battlefield. And so he takes up this call. He follows this person into this battle that the Pope was putting together an army against some emperors. But before he leaves, he has a vision. And he has a vision of a beautiful palace that was decorated with weapons fit for a knight. And Vouch's book describes it this way. So I'm going to read a little bit from his book. It says, according to the legends of the three companions, which is one of the earliest writings that we have about St. Francis that was written by, again, three companions. So it says, according to the legends of the three companions, the young squire dreamed before his departure on this expedition that he found himself in a palace whose walls were decorated with lances, shining shields, and all the things that constituted the military hardware of a knight. Convinced that he was soon to become famous by exploits in battle, the sleeper asked, "For whom are such treasures intended?" And a mysterious voice answered, "These weapons are for you and your companions," which he interpreted as a favorable omen for the expedition that he was about to undertake. But he only got as far as Spoleto, where he once again came down with an illness. And then he was left behind, but he has another vision. And this time he hears the voice say, "Who can do more good, the master or the servant?" "The master," he answered, or Francis answered. "Then why are you looking for the servant rather than the master?" "Ah, Lord, what would you have me do?" "Return home, and there you will learn what is right for you to do. The vision that you had in a dream," so the first vision, "you must interpret in a completely new way." So Francis responds, he divests himself of his armor, his weapons, gives his horse away, and he returns to Assisi, once again, a failure. So how does the life of this medieval saint, this Francis so far, as we've kind of gone with him, how does this speak to us today, or what does it have to say to us? And how is it possible to label Francis an unbeliever and model of religious faith? So I just want to focus on a few things. So first, I think it's very important we understand Francis in the context of his social and religious world. Our tendency in kind of the contemporary secular West, or at least some tendencies, is to try to diagnose people like Francis through the lens of modern science and medicine. Thus, we might conclude that Francis suffered from PTSD or even mental illness brought on by significant trauma. Now, this may or may not be true, but I think if we reduce Francis to these labels, we flatten his character. And anyone who experiences trauma or mental illness, I think, as we all know, are much more than their diagnosis. So even though there may be some of that going on here, we can't just simply reduce what happens to Francis to that kind of diagnosis. Because what is clear is the violence of war and the captivity that he encountered became the catalyst for his conversion and his transformation. Now, second, we have to understand Francis within his medieval religious world, and we have to take that medieval religious world seriously. A big part of what I'm trying to talk about in this podcast is this new world that we're inhabiting, where people no longer believe in kind of a higher spiritual reality. But we have to acknowledge that this higher spiritual reality was very real for Francis. So when we encounter him in the writings about him, we hear about visions and dreams and miracles, angels, demons. All of this is an important part of this reality. And I think acknowledging this difference is crucial for letting Francis speak to us today. Now, I want to say a couple things here. I don't think this means we have to return to the religious world of Francis, though I think some fundamentalist Christians today think this way. And for them, it's like getting back to the world of and culture of the Bible. They might say, well, we should get back to the world of Francis. That's not at all what I'm saying, but we need to take it seriously. And nor am I trying to present, or do I think we should present Francis as a modern liberal Protestant, like strip it all away, because this is just to remake Francis in our own image. Instead, Francis needs to be interpreted within his religious world for a new cultural and religious paradigm. So this means taking seriously the social and religious experience of Francis as it comes to us in the various writings about him, and then translating this experience for an increasingly religionless world. Hopefully that makes sense. And I hope we can see the distinction there. And part of this comes from Bonhoeffer's emphasis upon religionless faith, in which he's not a fundamentalist, but he also critiques Bultmann and what he considers to be liberal theology for just reducing everything to what makes sense for a secular West. Now, third, I think when we encounter Francis in this way, his life has a lot to teach us about faith and what it means to be human. As a young man, clearly, Francis was a true believer. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is he had a strong understanding of what life was about. He thought he knew what life was about. Glory, honor, and wealth attained through success on the battlefield. Knighthood was his ticket up the mountain to a beautiful wife and a beautiful family, and to wealth and land and all of those things. It was his ticket to the upper echelon of Assisi. And of course, in medieval Europe, this included religion and the church, because it was, after all, on behalf of the Pope that Francis was on his way to Spoleto to fight on the battlefield. And yet, Francis failed, and he returns to Assisi a broken man. And this is really the main point I want to make here today. At the ground level of this Franciscan life is failure. Francis's failure on the battlefield shattered his vision of reality and altered the way he understood his identity. Failure causes confusion and disorientation as the beliefs that we once held tightly no longer make sense. And then in response, we try to get our bearings by creating new forms of meaning. And we're forced then to reinterpret our lives, which is exactly what the voice said to Francis. Again, going back to that story, the voice said, "The vision that you had in a dream, you must interpret in a completely new way." This happens to the young people that I take on Franciscan pilgrimage. They're confronted with a new reality. They're dropped in the middle of a foreign country with a different language. For some of them, many of them, different religious beliefs and practices. They're pushed physically as we walk up and down the beautiful Italian hillside. They're pushed spiritually as they encounter people who see the world very differently than they do. And as we make our way from Assisi to Rome, the cracks become visible. Walking itself lends itself to talk therapy, the working out of our inner thoughts through conversation as we distract ourselves from our burning muscles. So while I was just in Italy, my daughter and I were together. She's 22, she's going to get married, she's been dealing with some things, and she just told me how hitting the hills, going up the hills, is a great way to work out some frustrations and some angst. Fatigue shatters the facade of self-confidence, and the anxieties and the fears just come trickling out. So every time I take students on this pilgrimage, we conclude in Rome with a final dinner where we talk about their experience and what they've learned. And I am always overwhelmed by their response. They talk about their anxieties and their fears, how they don't know what the future holds, and how they're afraid of letting other people down. And there's a lot of tears, and there's some laughter, and there's a real sense that the journey has uncovered something very profound. Pilgrimage strips away our attempts at self-sufficiency and creates the conditions for conversion and transformation. And these students are slowly converted to a different way of life and a new way of being, grounded in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and modeled by St. Francis.